Hi, this is Bob Pryor. Today I'm talking to you about identifying a function from its graph. So we're going to be given the graph of either a sine or cosine function, and we need to fill in all the pieces. It's the y-intercept that tells us whether it's sine or cosine. If the y-intercept is 0, if it's at the origin, then it's a sine function. And if the y-intercept is either a maximum or a minimum, then it's a cosine function. All right, the value of a. That's the amplitude, and we can recognize that by the y-axis values. And also it tells us whether the function is reflected or not, whether it's reflected about the x-axis. And if it is, then a is a negative number. The value of b. We already know that the period is 2 pi divided by b. You can write that as p equals 2 pi over b. And we can find b by using some algebra, multiplying each side by b. That eliminates b on the right side, and then we can divide each side by p to come up with the formula b equals 2 pi over p. Let's put that into practice. Here's the formula again. B, the value of b, the frequency, is 2 pi over p. So when the period is 5 pi, b is 2 pi over 5 pi, simply 2/5. Pi's divide out. If the period is 6 pi, b is 2 pi over 6 pi. Again, pi's divide out, and also we can divide out 2 to get b equals 1/3. If the period is a fraction, we have to divide 2 pi over the fraction. And then we'll rewrite that as multiplication. 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal, 4 over 3 pi. Here the pi's divide out again, and we get 8/3. Okay, let's put it all together now. And it's all about getting clues from the graph. We need to, from the graph, identify whether it's a sine or cosine function, whether it's reflected or not, what the amplitude is, the period, and the frequency. And we'll do these one step at a time. In the first graph, we see that the y-intercept is at 0, 2. It's a maximum. And that means it's got to be a cosine function. And it's not reflected. The amplitude is 2. The period is, we see, 7 pi over 2. And the frequency, well, that's 2 pi divided by 7 pi over 2. We write that as 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal, 2 over 7 pi, and the pi's divide out. We get 4/7. That's the value of b. So we can put it all together now and say that f of x is a, 2, cosine of b, 4/7 x. F of x equals 2 cosine of 4/7 x. In this next example, the graph starts at the origin, at a 0. Well, that means it's a sine function. It's not reflected. And the amplitude is 3. The period, well, we're not given the period. Instead, we're given the quarter period this time. So we need to multiply. 1 quarter period, like 1/4, we need to multiply by the reciprocal, 4 over 1. And that gives us 8 pi over 3. That's the period of the function. So we use that value, 8 pi over 3, when we calculate the frequency. B equals 2 pi over 8 pi over 3. The pi's divide out. We get here 6 over 8, which is 3/4. Our function is f of x equals a, it's a 3, sine of b, 3/4, x. Don't forget the x. That's an easy one to forget. In our next example, again, we're not given the period. Instead, we're given the half period. Notice it starts at a minimum, and that's actually a cosine function, but it's reflected. So we notice I have up there that a is a negative number. Amplitude is 4/3, but we're writing a as negative 4/3. Now, given the half period, 4 pi over 9, we have to multiply by the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2 over 1, and that gives us 8 pi over 9. That's the period. And now that we have the period, 8 pi over 9, we can find the frequency. B equals 2 pi over 8 pi over 9. And that's 2 pi over 1 times 9 over 8 pi. The pi's divide out. And we can divide also 2 into the 2 and the 8 and get 1/4. So we end up with 9 over 4. And that's the value of B. F of x equals, notice it's a negative 4/3 times cosine of 9/4 x. Okay, here's our last example. This function starts at the origin. It's a 0, so it's a sine function. Because it goes downward first, it's reflected. So the f of x is a negative a. In this case, the amplitude is 1, but we're going to use the value of a equals -1. We don't have the period right away. We have instead the 3/4 period. And that means that we need to multiply by the reciprocal of 3/4, which is 4/3. Divide out 4, divide out 3, and we're left with 3 pi. So the period is 3 pi, and the frequency, B, is 2 pi divided by 3 pi. Well, that's pretty simple. Divide out the pi's, and we're left with 2/3. So f of x equals a value, -1, or just negative, sine of 2/3 x. And that's how we find functions, cosine and sine, from their graphs. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I'll see you next time. Take care.